Format is a brain-based design model that engages all learners. And in this session, we're going to take a look at the two actions that define both learning style and the learning process. The first action is how we like to take in information. And some of us prefer to feel, and some of us prefer to think, but we all do both. And there's a spectrum that we move through as we move through the learning process. We're going to particularly focus on the action called processing and the two ends of that spectrum of watching and doing. What does watching and doing mean as a learning preference, and how does this show up in the learning experience? When you look at the model of feeling and thinking, that action, and the action of watching and doing, and they combine, what emerges is a model for learning, and it also defines the parameters of preference. For example, a learning style 1 is a 1 because they prefer to feel and watch, and they spend more time in that part of the learning cycle. The action of processing and the two ends of that spectrum of watching and doing, there's a preference that you have on that particular process, and the learning type measure gives you a score of +11 to -11 that defines where you fall on that spectrum. So when you have a negative number, you're saying that you have a preference for the action of watching when you are processing new information and new knowledge. So what does that mean? Watching, a preference for watching means that you make sense of new information through internal reflection. So you're seeking meaning, and you rely really heavily on your inner voice and the sharing of others, and you look for commonalities in your experiences, and you're intrigued in the differences in your experiences, and there's a heavy emphasis on reflection as you move through the learning process. On the other end of the spectrum, in the plus score range, or those of us that are doers, and we make sense of new knowledge and new information through external action. We look to extend the information out into the real world, and it's through that process that we learn. We have a heavy emphasis on action and how to, and we're interested in application, and we learn through that application, and we practice using the new information, and it's through that practice that we learn the new information, and through refining it that we move through the learning process. These two dimensions form the four primary parts of the format learning cycle. On top of this, we add right brain and left brain processing. And what we end up with is 8 steps. So there's an 8-step design and delivery model when you're using format. What we're going to look at right now are the steps that connect directly to the end of the spectrum called watching. So when I'm watching and I'm honoring that need of watching as a trainer, I need to really pay attention to what is happening in that part of the learning process. And remember, we said meaning, inner voice, sharing, reflection. So the types of activities that we would see in these steps would look very different than we might see on the other end of the spectrum called doing. So for example, we might see partner dialogues, group conversation, comparing and contrasting the themes that are coming up in that conversation in the step that we see here, which is attend. When we move to image, we see individual reflection and visualization, groups working on image activities, creating visual metaphors, really seeing the themes that are emerging through the learning process. On the other end of the spectrum, called doing, in these two steps we see a very different type of action that's happening. In the step called extend, we see the learners acting on the information, and they're assimilating new knowledge through projects, case studies. They're refining the application, and they're learning through that process. They're practicing for real-world application. In the refined step, what's happening is they're really assessing their application, and they're learning from that assessment so that it will equip them to go out and do this in the real world. The question becomes, what type of balance do you have between these two very different ways of processing information, between watching and reflecting and action orientation and doing? Because when we balance this really well, we have great sense of movement from the learner, but also we ensure that there's learning transfer, and we ensure that we are engaging every learning style.